When we ask parents why they think kids turn to drugs and alcohol, parents tend to say peer pressure. However, when you ask kids the same question, why they would turn to drugs and alcohol, they say stress and anxiety.
That was Jessica Lahey, and this is Roar. Hi, everybody. This is Danielle Davies, the host of Roar. Today's guest is Jessica Lahey, teacher, writer, podcast host, speaker, all-around good person, and author of The Gift of Failure and the Addiction Inoculation. Her work explores resilience, failure, and what kids actually learn from the adults around them. Work that's helped so many women rethink what it actually means to show up as a parent. Because while we say we want to raise independent, capable kids, a lot of us, myself included, feel this constant pressure to step in, smooth things over, and get it right. And for parents, moms especially, that pressure can show up in ways we don't always talk about, shaping how we parent, how we cope, what our kids are quietly absorbing from all of it. So today we're talking about that tension and what happens when we start, if we can, to loosen our grip. Jess, I'm so glad you're here. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm so happy to be here.
I'm just absolutely thrilled. I'm going to jump right in because I have a lot of questions for you. And like I preempted by saying this almost feels like a therapy appointment for myself, but I think it probably feels like that for a lot of listeners and a lot of parents. Everybody's like, get to my question, because if you're a parent, your highest stakes endeavor is your kids, right? So, So a lot of your work challenges that instinct to step in and fix things and prevent struggle. That instinct is so strong for parents. Why is it so hard to let our kids fail?
I talk about this from a neurological perspective. It just feels like our kid is in danger. Put really, really simply, the way our brain deals with the information that something is going wrong with our kid is it's just like, ooh, emergency, step in, do something, fix it. But that trigger for when that gets turned on has so moved into a place where, like, oh my gosh, fix it. You know, my daughter, I have two kids. My eldest is 27 and my youngest is 22 and just starting to apply for jobs. And I'm overwhelmed by how often I want to step in. Like there were little things, just dumb. And I can't believe I'm going to admit this kind of stuff, but let me just admit this kind of stuff so that you can hear that the person who wrote a book about the gift of failure, about letting your kids fail and learn from those mistakes, how bad it is in my head sometimes. So there are a bunch of jobs. I have opinions, and it's so hard to get a job right now. And she and her girlfriend are both just applying, interviewing, not hearing anything back. It's a lot. And then a job came up. I found a job listing that happened across my my desk, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. That's perfect. Can I pretend to be her to ask about like when the start date would be, like all these dumb, insane thoughts of like, wait, you're talking in your own head about pretending to be your daughter so that you can communicate with that organization, find out what the start date is so that she can get a job. That's bananas. And if you heard about that coming from someone else, you would be like, what are you doing? So having this constant like conversation with myself, I have a mantra that sort of comes up, which is, do I want this to be done my way or the perfect way right now? Or do I want her to be able to do it herself next time? And obviously she's 22. Obviously this is her. This is even more so than college, which was her thing. Getting a job, like not only is this about getting a job, this is about learning how to get a job. And I can't be within 1,000 yards of that. That's, I'm here for advice. I'm here for proofreading a resume, but I cannot be anywhere near that. So it is a constant struggle. Even when my kids are 22 and 27, I'm constantly like, just churning with how I can insert myself and make things happen for them. It's nuts.
It's crazy. I'm glad you actually said it because I've actually been like looking things up for myself recently where I'm like enmeshed, like parent enmeshment, like all this stuff I generally try not to talk about my kids too much, but my son is in college in Hawaii and we live in New Jersey. So that was like a really big, I'm like, I got this down. Like I let
Mhm.
him go to Hawaii. Like
Yeah.
I am so proud of myself, but it's actually made it so much worse because I'm like, you're even driving when I'm asleep. Like there's no time that I'm not overly invested
Mhm.
in your safety and well-being so that anytime he calls, he might just call to be like, "Hey, had a great day." But if it's anything at all negative, I'm because of the distance or that's just exacerbated it.
Mhm.
But it's just interesting because you can make all these strides
Mhm.
and then just one little thing you can step back and be like, "How can I
Mhm.
facilitate this for you or
Well,
better
and
facilitate it?"
here's something that happened a couple years ago. So my husband and I were in San Francisco and got a text from my eldest, said, "Can I call you?" And it turns out my eldest got in a car accident. It was minor, it was nothing, but it was in a rental car. And he didn't realize we hadn't had the conversation about how insurance works with rental cars. And because he thought he was still on our insurance, he didn't get insurance. And so he was asking a lot of logistical questions about how to handle this. This is like at the accident scene. And I said, we need to loop your sister into this text thread because this could happen to her and she needs to learn from this too. So how can we maximize? So yeah, we're going to talk you through some of this stuff and help you think about, here's how this works. And of course, there's so much to be learned from this. So now like Ben learned, yeah, you get the car insurance and this is how rental cars work, and he actually learned a ton from that experience, and it was luckily no one was hurt. But my daughter, if she had missed that whole text thread, if we hadn't moved that to our group chat off of an individual chat, then she wouldn't have learned everything that her brother learned, and that was really important information for her too, because in a couple of years she's going to be eligible to rent cars too. So why not make it a big let's learn from each other's mistakes kind of situation too. So there are so many times when my first thought inevitably my daughter got stuck in our car somewhere. I can't remember what happened. It was probably a flat tire or something. Yeah, it was a flat tire. My first thought was I must get in the car and drive there.
Yes.
Like I have to go now to go rescue her from this. And she ended up learning so much and being so resourceful and figuring a whole bunch of different things out. And it was great. It ended up being a great experience. The person she was going to pick up also learned some stuff about figuring out an alternate way to get home. It was great all around. Was she really nervous and anxious at the time? And was I nervous and anxious at the time? Yeah. And sitting on my hands at home and keeping my car keys out of reach was tough, but it was really, really important. And now she has so much more confidence around being able to handle stuff.
Yeah, yeah,
That's less of a worry.
it's crazy too because you can see it happen when you do manage to step back and
Hmm.
like how they respond, and there is so much more confidence there. And
Hmm.
I'm thinking of so many instances, but my son bought a new to him car in Hawaii, and my
Hmm.
husband was really like, "Don't do it. I don't think it's a good idea. You don't know what you're looking for. Like, don't do it." And of course, he did it. He bought the car
Hmm.
and he needed it. I'm actually
Hmm.
glad that he bought the car, but almost immediately he called me and was like, "Dad was right. The tires I got to get all new wheels." I'm like, "Well, wait, it might just be low. Like, let's start there." And I was like, "Just call." And he was in a rush and he didn't know his way around, and while on the phone with me, he managed to, find a garage, drive over to the garage, get air in his hair. And he actually said, he's like, "I have never felt like more of an adult." And I'm like,
Yeah.
which is, so that's, you know what? He had to go to Hawaii. He had to
Yeah.
go
Yeah.
for his own self-protection. Cause otherwise I'd be like, circling around him. Um,
Yeah.
well, and I want to weave in, you talk about parenting and this idea of stepping back or obviously letting kids learn things on their own. But you were also you're an expert in addiction, and you've written the addiction inoculation. So I want to kind of weave this in early and
Hmm.
say, you talk not just about prevention and your own experiences, but also about what kids learn from the adults around them.
Hmm.
How did your understanding of addiction shape the way you think about parenthood? Specifically, you're a mom.
Yeah, and actually, I want to back up just a second and make sure your listeners know. So I'm actually, before I wrote Gift to Failure, I was in the classroom for 20 years, middle school, high school, taught every grade from 6th to 12th, was an education journalist at the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Washington Post, had a column at the New York Times for 3 years on the intersection of parenting and education. So even though I'm telling all these anecdotal stories, that's not where my expertise is coming from. So I'm an expert in, learning, education, that sort of stuff. So what was interesting about the addiction inoculation is that in the interim between writing The Gift of Failure, which I got the contract for in 2013, and then it came out in 2015. As soon as I got the contract for The Gift of Failure, I had to get sober. It was time. My dad just confronted me and was like, you're definitely an alcoholic, because he knows,
Oh,
because he was raised by one. And I talk about substance use prevention as being like a 100-piece puzzle. And that 100-piece puzzle of like dropping all these little clues into place, real information around substances and what they do to the brain and all that sort of stuff, is also part of prevention. So substance use prevention plays double duty as both substance use prevention, but as giving people the information they're going to need in order to get to recovery faster. Because you don't, that 100th piece of the puzzle drops into place and you realize, oh, I'm in deep doo-doo. I need to get better. I'm ready. It can't fall into place unless pieces 1 through 99 are there. And so much of substance use prevention are those pieces. So my kids, because they were born to my biological children, are at a higher risk of developing substance use disorder. It's just, genetics and epigenetics are about 50 to 60% of the risk picture. And so with my kids, it was particularly urgent. This wasn't a like, oh, I don't need to worry about that. No one gets to be in the boat of, oh, I don't need to worry about that. But I really had to get on the stick and start dealing with it. So a ton changed when I got sober. And then I looked at my kids and I'm like, crap, if I grew up with many generations of people with substance use disorder and I'm just the latest one, what does that mean for them? Like I didn't know. I couldn't find a great resource that covered both the best practices for parenting and best practices for education. So I'm very fortunate I got to write that book. So I did a couple of years of research before I even started writing that book, because the way nonfiction publishing works is you have to sell a proposal, and that proposal is a really deep outline of a book with chapter summaries and a sample chapter and all that stuff. So it took me about 2 years to research and write the proposal and sell the book. And that's been, I think, I'm very proud of The Gift of Failure, but I think The Addiction Inoculation was the book I was meant to write. That is what has become my life's work, and getting to help people talk about substance use prevention, even the people who don't want to talk about substance use prevention, to find ways into that conversation, to ease that burden, to ease that first hurdle into the conversation. That's become sort of my life's work again. And I absolutely love it. And I absolutely adore not just talking to, so when I go into like a school or community organization, I often get to talk to the kids during the day. And then sometimes I'll talk to teachers in the afternoon at a school. And then in the evening, I talk to community. And my job is to start conversations, to give people the vocabulary to have conversations about these really, really important topics like substance use prevention. And those two things go hand in hand with Gift of Failure. I mean, and sorry to mix so many metaphors, but there's a dovetail
yeah.
between Gift of Failure and addiction inoculation around competence, self-efficacy, self-advocacy, um, the feeling that the actions you take can affect change, and making a mistake or not being able to do something and having to struggle to learn how to do it and then mastering it. That feeling right there of mastery, competence, building self-efficacy is really preventative against substance use disorder. And it's an amazing source of dopamine in the brain. So when you achieve something that you didn't think you could do or that you've had to work hard to figure out, the dopamine just gets released in the brain, and that's a wonderful natural source of dopamine rather than having to go look for it somewhere else.
Okay, real quick. If you're listening and thinking more women should be hearing conversations like this, the best way to support the show is just to follow or subscribe wherever you are. It really does help it reach more people. Thanks so much. Okay, back to the show. Let me ask you a question. So I know, and I know, like, and I appreciate that you have all the science background and that you're actually able to speak about it both ways, right? Because if I had an audience who is a scientific audience, you could speak about it that way. And if I don't, and since I'm not, I imagine my listeners aren't either, you're able to talk about it anecdotally and kind of.
And I mention it very specifically because I think there are a lot of people who put themselves out as experts on topics and then are absolutely willing to, whether it's an expert who speaks outside of their expertise, that I think is just as damaging as someone who's willing to just put themselves out there as an expert and doesn't have, the research cred behind them. So I just like to make sure it's not me talking out of my butt.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, I'm glad because I didn't include that. And I think that's really important, specifically as I ask you the next question, because especially regarding addiction, well, both of these things, really, there's a real pushback from just every woman that I know. I know so many women who are, first of all, like checking their kids 60,000 grades. Did they ask this teacher that? And they're all over it. And it's hard to be a parent. I mean, again, this is totally anecdotal. This is no research. This is just my experience. It is hard. It is no joke. It is a lot of work. And I think any parent will say that. But the addiction part also, there's pushback because we are a culture that really touts the use of alcohol. And we have normalized so much things like, I need a drink after today, or wine mom culture. I mean, I haven't drank in 8 months. And just last night, I said to my husband, I'm like, you know what I could really use right now is a really big glass of wine. I was like, really not going to do it.
It's really complicated not having an escape hatch. I've had to learn all kinds of stuff. But it's funny you say that because I was, I get a lot of questions about sort of the mommy wine culture, all that sort of stuff. But then when you stop drinking, and especially when you learn a lot about marketing and you learn about how alcohol is marketed to us, occasionally you'll be watching a show or a movie and you're like, whoa, that's a lot, not just a lot of drinking, but a lot of messaging that is the obvious answer. And so, so my guilty pleasure watch lately has been the show The Madison. It's set in Montana. It's light and nothing and wonderful and it's sad, but it's also anyway. At every single turn, when anything gets a little bit hard or complicated, someone will reach into a bag and pull out like tiny airplane, like, here's how I got through my divorce. And she pulls like 6 little vodka bottles out of her purse. Or, in order to go to therapy, she and her therapist get drunk together. It's like, and fun. And I have no problem with people who don't have a problem with alcohol drinking. On the other hand, it's really worrisome to me that kids are getting the message that, that is the obvious first stop to managing, you go to a therapist, you're going to drink with your therapist. You have problems that you got to handle a grown-up problem, you drink at it. And that's what worries me. And to step it back and sort of give it to you from a real world perspective. So whenever I speak at a school or a community organization, I make a little welcome video and I give everyone my email address so that they can ask me questions ahead of time or tell me what they want me to talk about. And I get tons and tons of questions. And then when I'm doing the event, I give people my email address again. And inevitably, the most amazing questions come from the kids. Lately, I've been getting a lot of questions about, is it okay that my parents give me melatonin every night to sleep? And so that's really 2 separate questions. Is there a problem with taking melatonin every night to sleep? And the answer is, it's not the worst thing in the world, but also your body will change its melatonin release because you're supplementing. But the real issue for me there is when you give kids something every single night in order to have a normal bodily function, something that is normal and natural and something we're supposed to be able to do, what you're telling them is, here's a medication for this so that you need to have for this absolutely normal human function. And a lot of parents are giving melatonin in lieu of looking at sort of evening bedtime sleep hygiene. By the way, my very, very favorite book about this is by Lisa L. Lewis, and it's called The Sleep Deprived Teen. It's
Oh,
fantastic. But yeah, those things worry me. And it's not just messaging about like drink at that problem, it's messaging of you're nervous on a flight, you take a Xanax. You're nervous about this, you do that. Those sorts of regular, totally normalized messaging, especially around alcohol, because why on earth are we talking about drugs and alcohol? Alcohol is a drug. Why aren't we just talking about drugs? Somehow alcohol gets moved out of that box because it's so normalized in our society, especially around things like sports or, dating. And, there's all sorts of places where alcohol is just an totally accepted, totally normal part of our human existence. And some of those things just were modeling some weird behaviors for kids, some maladaptive behaviors for kids.
Yeah, and pardon me. And I have to say, it's funny you're talking about seeing it on a show years ago. When I was involved in politics, I used to love the show Scandal. Talk about taking a break from your daily life. Let's just continue stressing out about this. Yeah. But she was famous for always pouring a humongous glass of red wine and eating popcorn. Well, it was like if the show was on, it was so...
Yeah.
It was marketed so well. It seemed like this is, and I feel like every time I watched it, I had a glass of red wine, and I skipped the popcorn. Of course, that was not nearly as compelling, but I just, and I'm a grown adult who sees what's happening. So when you aim this towards children, or when they see us, I've seen, God forbid, my own kids have said to me, "Oh, Mom, you should have a glass of wine." That's probably, that's surely not signaling anything good. Mm-hmm. Can I ask you a question? I know that in other countries, this is not anything that I was planning to ask you, so bear with me. In other countries, alcohol is, particularly wine, is like a much more universally accepted.
You're dancing, right? You're dancing into one of the best, most beloved questions that I get. So, and the biggest myth I love to bust. So go ahead.
Yes, bust it. So, okay, they'll say kids drink alcohol when they're 16. Right. Kids drink at the pub in Ireland or have wine with their lunch in Italy.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So if anyone's going to get mad at me about anything, and keep in mind, I work very hard to push people just a little bit to think in a new way. But if people get angry at me, then they stop listening, and then I'm not doing my job well, right? So I work really hard to balance that. The thing that people get most upset with me about is the idea, and I write about it in the Addiction Inoculation, that, a lot of people there are two big myths in parenting, and one of them around alcohol. And one of them is that if you give your kids sips, that they'll grow up to be moderate drinkers, that somehow, if you model moderation for them, that it will be no big deal and they won't flip out and go nuts and drink a ton the first time it's available to them freely. And I 100% bought into that and was a fan of that. And, because I love to read, I've romanticized alcohol, and I talk about this in the Addiction Inoculation as well. And in fact, one of the hardest things for me is when I'm watching a show and I'm watching someone have a glass of wine to relax. I don't miss the wine exactly, but I miss that hatch. I miss that, I miss my ability to have that, but I can't have one glass of wine. That's just not how I work. Okay, so the European moderation myth. Here's the problem with the European moderation myth. According to the World Health Organization, the European region as a whole has the highest rates of disease and death attributable to alcohol. So when you look at disease burden attributable to alcohol and death, cause of death, all cause of death, alcohol, they get both of those awards, right? If you look at the heaviest drinking countries in the world, 7 out of the top 10 are in the European region. However, so then people get very heated. I made a video about this. I have these like 400 different videos at my website on all topics from both books. So I made the
It's
video about
awesome, by the
that.
way. That's awesome. Okay, go
They're really short. They're
ahead.
like 90 seconds. I made that video. And then I had to make like 6 follow-up videos because people were so pissed off with me. And I had to break down like every country and who's the exception. And so you brought up a couple interesting things, which is number one, yes, there are exceptions. What's fascinating about the exception countries is that they, generally speaking, it's not acceptable to be really falling over drunk in public. That's just not a thing. So, for example, Italy has one of the higher rates of daily drinking in the world, in the European region, sorry, but one of the lower rates of disease and death attributable to alcohol. So what you're seeing there is more of a moderation culture
Oh,
than imbibing until you fall over. Whereas if you look at places like the UK, when you look at places like Ireland, when you look at places like some of the other countries that have a heavier disease and death burden, I was in I was in Northern Ireland a bunch of years ago when I was still teaching full time, and I had like my parent and mother hat on watching these kids who have essentially alcohol poisoning laying in the street on a weekend night, and I just want to scoop them all up and take them to the hospital. And I went to school in England for a couple of years. It's just a part of the culture to get really hammered, and drinking is a big part of the social thing. So when you look at the exceptions, what we're talking about are places that have created a culture where it's just not cool to be falling over drunk. And that is sort of proof that we can build cultures on the family level, on the state level, on the school level, on the community level around alcohol, right? The other thing we have to keep in mind here is that just modeling moderation for someone like me who can't learn moderation is not going to have any effect. Like, you can model moderation for me all day long, and it's not going to have any effect on whether or not I can moderate alcohol. Plus, I have this genetic predisposition and all sorts of other things. The other big myth is, by the way, is the kids are going to drink anyway, and so therefore I might as well have them to my house, take away everyone's keys. They'll be safe. They can drink
oh,
here. No one can drive. And the problem with that is that kids who grow up in a family without any consistent messaging around drinking, like the fact that it's not that you're not supposed to drink. Most people say until it's legal for you. I like to stay away from that as a reason, because that's a just because answer, and teenagers aren't big into just because answers. I like to say until your brain is done developing, which happens in the early to mid 20s. So no, you can't drink until we don't drink in this house until your brain is done developing. Kids who don't grow up with that message are 70% more likely to start drinking early. This is based on a study that just came out about 6 weeks ago
oh
from
dear.
a huge data set. The other thing we know is, generally speaking, kids who grow up in a family with a consistent and clear message of no, not until your brain is done developing, and kids have information on what's happening with their brain, those kids just have much lower rates of alcohol use, drug and alcohol use, whereas kids who grow up in a permissive atmosphere around drugs and alcohol have much higher rates of developing substance use disorder and drinking early or using early. And the reason for that is that the younger a kid is when they first start using, the higher their lifelong risk of developing substance use disorder, by big numbers, not by small amounts. So understanding that the reason I repeat constantly delay, delay, delay is not just about brain development, which is super important, because adolescent drinking and drug use is not the same thing as adult drinking and drug use. Once that brain is done developing, it's much less dangerous for the brain to use drugs and alcohol. But when the adolescent cognitive development is happening, which again that door doesn't really creak shut slowly until the early to mid 20s, it's much more dangerous. Short-term and long-term damage to the brain. We see it in lots of different substances and lots of different studies and brain studies. Anyway, lots of reasons that those two myths, and when you're doing the thing with, having other people's kids over to drink in the basement when you take the keys away, not only are you raising your own kids' risk of developing substance use disorder over their lifetime, because they're more likely to start early, you're raising their peers' risk as well, because peer cohort is such an important part of the substance use prevention picture, not just because kids are more likely to do drugs and alcohol if their friends are more likely to do drugs and alcohol, or sorry, if their friends are doing drugs and alcohol, your kids' perception of how risky it is drops if they see their parents or their friends doing drugs and alcohol. And I haven't seen these studies, but I would love to know if kids are seeing it on Scandal and the Madison and all these different places, and they're seeing that that's a legitimate coping mechanism. Does their perception of the dangers of alcohol and drugs drop? Probably. I mean, we know if they see it in their own family and in their peer group that it drops. So, we want them to have a healthy understanding of the actual risk, not anyway, we want them to understand the real risks.
Okay, this leads me to two questions.
Sure.
I have two questions based on that. I'm going to ask you the first one first. I feel, again, this is not scientific. This is my own observation. I feel like I see a connection, and tell me what you think. When you look at it, do you see this connection between parents, the pressure to do it right, to not fail your kids, to have them have the best go at it, whatever that looks like for you, and how we cope with that pressure, i.e. possibly turning to drink. It almost feels like it feeds into it because, and then if your kid has a bad day, that pressure is even more of, I think I'll have a drink, because you're kind of coping with your own failure or theirs or your perceived
You want
failure.
the research?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So, a couple of years ago, we have a couple of really huge, wonderful data sets. We have the Monitoring the Future data set that comes out of University of Michigan. Love it, love it, love it. Big dork. Every time that survey comes out, it comes out in a big report once a year. I'm like, woohoo, let's read it all. And then there's a cohort that's been going for a couple of years called the ABCD survey. That one's massive. That's going to give us so much amazing research as we move through. So we're getting data out of those. We're getting papers out of those data sets all the time. And just in the last year, what we know is when we ask parents why they think kids turn to drugs and alcohol, parents tend to say peer pressure. We would love to believe it's because the bad kid influenced my kid, right?
Oh, totally.
Right. And peer cohort is definitely part of it. It's the reason there's an entire chapter on peers in the addiction inoculation. However, when you ask kids the same question, why they would turn to drugs and alcohol, they say stress and anxiety. So when you look at then, if you start looking at what's causing the stress and anxiety for them, that feeling of needing to be perfect, needing to succeed, needing to fulfill their parents' hopes and dreams and wish for what they want their kids to be, all that sort of stuff, living up to, and then, for their own part, being financially self-sufficient. That's really scary. Adulting is really scary. We're also specifically talking about a group of kids that's just come out of COVID. My 22-year-old, spent a lot of high school in, doing COVID stuff and not being able to go on dates or see friends or do all that stuff. So if that's true, if that, when we ask kids and they say, yeah, it's stress and anxiety, then, and I am not one of those people who's like, ooh, let's eliminate all stress and anxiety. But what I do know, and thank goodness for books like Lisa D'Amour's Under Pressure, wonderful book about helping reframe stress and anxiety for kids, is this. Stress and anxiety are part of what keeps us moving forward, motivation. So I use the analogy a lot with kids, like, yes, sometimes like when I'm on deadline, I am stressed out because I have a deadline. But what I also know is that I'm better with a deadline. I'm sharper, I'm more on task. So I have a literary agent and she's wonderful and she doesn't tend to pressure me. But what I will do is email her and say, I will have chapter 6 to you by Friday. I made that deadline up. It's totally of my own making, but she's going to hold me to it. And that's why I also have two friends. I have a rabbit behind me and we call it our accountability bunny.
I love that.
It's accountability buddy. Not only do I have two best friends who will hold me to deadlines if I ask them to, I also have a larger group of sort of colleague-y peer friend group who once a year, we sort of talk about deadlines and goals and things like that, and they'll hold me to them. And those are all really important. Is it stressful that and especially when I was hosting the podcast a lot, I was constantly talking about my goals for the year. And then, so I'm putting like my own personally made deadlines out into the world. It would be a lot less stressful if I would tell no one about that, because then if I screw it up or if I don't make it, I'm less embarrassed, I guess. Fewer people will hold me to it, but it's really helpful for me. So if we can model for our kids that some stress is really, really useful and it's very important. The other thing we need to think about is when we talk about risk factors, a lot of parents say, well, I don't want to tell my kid that they have a genetic predisposition for substance use disorder because that'll freak them out, right? Or they might think, well, it's going to be this way anyway, so I might as well just do it. We would never talk that way, by the way, about like risk for hypertension or diabetes or, all of these other health risks, that it's important that we know what our risk factors are so that we can eat well or choose to exercise or whatever that thing is. The other thing is that I talk about this a little bit in the addiction inoculation, that we moved during a really risky period of time for my daughter. Transitions are a riskier time for starting to use substances. And I was talking to Dr. Dan Siegel, one of my heroes, and I told him how worried I was about my particular child's risk factors and the fact that we moved her during this particularly risky time. And he said, Jess, I feel like I shouldn't have to remind you that one of the main purposes of adolescence and the adolescent brain development that's going on is to seek out novelty. And every time you achieve something new, every time you learn a new skill, every time you go out there and become competent in something new, which is what adolescents are driven to do naturally, you not only get that wonderful hit of dopamine, but you build your sense of competence and self-efficacy and mastery. And that's really great. So you can choose to keep framing this as a negative, as risk, which you're definitely transmitting to your kid. Or you could use this as an opportunity to think about, like, what novel experiences can I push her toward to help her develop more competence and more mastery and more feelings of self-efficacy. And just to define my terms, self-efficacy is the understanding that something around you is not the way you want it to be. This relationship isn't working for me. My teacher doesn't like me, whatever. And feeling like believing that if you take action, that you can affect change. It's like a cross between like hope and competence. Self-efficacy is the belief that my world, whatever, can be better, and that I have the power to change it if I take action. And kids who ended up in my rehab classroom, I taught in a rehab for adolescents for 5 years. The kids in my rehab classroom all had incredibly low levels of self-efficacy. Like, why bother? Why bother staying sober? Like, nothing in my world is going to change. I can't affect change in my life. I'm stuck in this group home. I have abusive parents. I don't know where my next meal's coming from. And none of that comes down to, my ability to change anything. So the more self-efficacy we can give kids, the better. That was a very long-winded answer to your question.
No. I'm loving it. I'm loving it. I'm like writing notes down everywhere. And then the other question that I wanted to pull out of that first thing that you said is, you were talking about the sips and giving the sips of alcohol, and it's proven to not actually be a great thing at all. And so what about the parents who've already done that? Yeah. What if we're dealing with, yes, like myself, obviously, this is why I want to know. Yeah. What about the parents who've already said, oh, a couple sips here, you're going to be responsible about it, though. This is how we learn to be responsible. What do you do when you feel like you've already messed the whole thing up?
The entire premise of the gift of failure is that we do the best we can. This is what we want to model for kids and teach kids. We do the best we can with the information we have. And if we learn how to do better, we apologize if we need to, or we explain if we need to, and then we move forward with the new information doing better. So yes, my eldest was allowed sips. I put some wine on his tongue. Excuse me, I hiccups as a baby because it was a really nice bottle of wine. And I figured, the first taste of wine should be this really nice bottle of wine. So what I did, and really who it affected, was my daughter, because she was still in the house. My son was off at college at the time, I think, at college. And for my daughter, it kind of, she felt it was a little unfair for her because the rules changed. And I didn't just rip the carpet out from under her and say, rip the rug out from under her and say, hi, haha, new rules. What I did was teach her what I know about the adolescent brain and the damage and the risk factors and the statistics, and said, and therefore, the rule in this house is no open containers in our house, like sitting around, because that's what my husband does for me, just because he cares about me and he doesn't want me to have to think about an open container. So if he has a beer with dinner, he finishes it or pours the rest out. And no, you can't use drugs or alcohol until your brain is done developing, because you know what I know. And here's all this great information on that you need to have in order to make good decisions. And did it feel a little unfair? Maybe. And then there were all kinds of things I was worried about. Like, am I just, you know, she had a she had a friend come home for Thanksgiving from college with her one year. And this friend lives in a country somewhere else where the drinking age is 18. So we're having my husband and my dad are having a little champagne. My mom doesn't drink. I don't drink. My eldest has been drinking age for a bunch of years. And so when it came to pouring champagne glasses, I said to the friend, I said, I know this is a little weird because the drinking age in your country is 18, but in this house, we don't drink until we're above the legal age, and therefore your brain is done developing. I was petrified about this, and you could see the tension in my daughter's face.
Oh,
She's like, "Is this going to be weird? Oh my god! Oh my god! My mom is such a freak." And he was like, the kid was like, "Okay." It just wasn't a deal. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't a deal. I don't know. Maybe there was lots of talk back at the college once they were back there about what a freak Phoebe's mom is, but I don't care. That's our rule,
is
and
this
I would love to be the fun, we all want to be like the fun, cool parent with the cool hangout house. And wouldn't it be more likely that kids would hang out at our house if we were a little more lax about drugs and alcohol, especially since, weed is legal in this state? Yeah, maybe. But, I'm sorry, the risk to my kids is just too high, given their genetics and given what I know about the adolescent brain and substance use. It just is.
Quick pause, because if you're listening to Roar, I have a feeling you're exactly the kind of person I write for. I send out a Substack newsletter where I go a little deeper, more personal stories, behind the scenes thoughts, and honestly, some of the things we don't always say out loud here. If you want to stay connected between episodes, you can find it at roarwithdanielledavies.substack.com. I'd love to have you there. And now, back to your regularly scheduled podcast. How do you, why am I not finding the word? Oh,
I don't know.
love menopause. How do you find the middle ground between, having a house where you're like, I am so off topic, but having a house, but I need to know, how do you have between, being the house where you're like, we're not going to drink until our brains are fully developed, and the fact that sometimes, I'm constantly like, you will not text and drive. You will not text and drive.
Right.
Texting and driving is bad. You're a danger.
Yeah.
And then I find out my kid texted and drove, and I'm like, I lose my mind. So sometimes they're going to do what I don't want them to do. They're going to go against my wisdom. Yeah. And I always am like, I'm the house. I will pick you up. I will not ask any questions. Because I would rather, obviously, they live through their mistake. Right. How do you kind of find that middle ground?
So I compare it to, here's what we don't want to do. What we don't want to do is use language from purity culture of my husband grew up in Utah, and a lot of the girls he grew up with were told something to the equivalent of losing your virginity makes you like a used piece of gum. No one's going to want to chew on that used piece of gum if you've lost your virginity. So that's what we don't want. We don't want this all or nothing, let alone that's all made up BS, whatever. What we do want is for kids to understand that, yeah, we screw up. This is a really important message also in the recovery world, because for adolescents who are recovering, relapse is just part of it. Like they just do relapse. The number of people who get sober young and never relapse is really small. So what we need kids to understand is um, that's not a fatal error. A friend that I text back and forth with, I sort of helped them get to a place where they knew they needed to get better and stop drinking. And they relapsed a lot at the beginning and they were always ashamed, but they would text me and I would say, okay, what did we learn? What did we learn from this relapse? Like you, you know, you feel like you've just lost everything, but you haven't. You learned so much in the interim, let alone you learned what it feels like when you move toward a relapse so that you can maybe now build some skills to sort of intercept those thoughts that weird, like many of us find that we were in our addicted brain way before we ever pick up that first drink to relapse or that first whatever. So for kids, it's really important for them to understand that to come at it without judgment, because what we really, really need is to keep communication going. We do not want to shut down communication. So this is not okay, but I love you. I support you. Thank you for making a really good decision about calling me. Like that means the world to me. I would much rather you make this mistake and trust me and your safety, so that we keep having this conversation. But this is not a fatal flaw. You're not like ruined now. It just means that we're going to try to take what we learned from this experience to try to do better next time. And if they're really talking to you, which would be great, and both the gift of failure and the addiction inoculation talk a lot about keeping communication going. There's also a wonderful book by Robin Silverman called Talk to Kids About How to Talk to Kids About Anything. And she includes a whole bunch in there about all the normal things that are really hard to talk to kids about. There's a couple of great books on that. Making sure that you're preserving the communication is super important because that's their lifeline to you. And even in college kids report that they still trust their parents' advice around health decision making, and this falls under decision making around health. So, and my favorite part, frankly, of the gift of the addiction inoculation isn't technically one that I came up with on my own. I asked a whole bunch of young adults and adolescents to give me their favorite excuses that they use when they don't want to use or drink at a party, or when they're out or when with their friends, and not feel like a big dweeb. And so there's like 2.5 pages of these excuses that kids came to me with for, understanding that no is a complete sentence and that's cool. But other excuses that they've used or could use that they've sort of loaded up for if they don't want to lose face, but they also just don't want to use. And they're really good. They're really cool.
That is awesome. Well, first of all, I'd love to see that. And it's funny because I actually have a college reunion coming up this summer. And everybody's like, we're going to go here and we're going to go there. And it's walking distance to the bars,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
like,
yeah.
and it's actually, and I'm actually like thinking in my head, do I say I don't drink? Do I just not drink?
Yeah.
It's interesting because it comes up no matter what your age, like, and especially for kids.
Yeah. It came up on Threads just the other day. Someone said, what do you say when you don't want to drink? And all these people had like these cryptic whatever. I'm like, I just say I'm an alcoholic, and then, but I also don't want, for me, it's just, you have to understand, if you read Addiction Inoculation, you understand that I was raised in a household with someone with substance use disorder where we were not allowed to talk about it. In fact, we were gaslit. We were told that what we were seeing was not what we were seeing. And I think that has put in me this need to be really honest. And also recovery, you have to be really honest when you're in recovery. And I'm not saying that means you go out there and you make other people feel uncomfortable. But for me, every single time I've ever in public said that I'm an alcoholic or that I'm in recovery, that has led to at least one conversation. And sometimes way down the road, someone remembers, oh, that Jess Lahey, that author person I saw at that thing, and she gave us our email, or I could find her on her website. I'm just going to reach out to her. And there are a bunch of conversations that I'm having with people right now who, through text or email, that just reached out. And some of them aren't ready to say why they've reached out yet, but I know why they reached out. The person I was talking about who kept relapsing, he texted me or DM'd me through social media of someone I knew from my childhood um, for, I don't know, 2 years before he finally admitted that the reason he had reached out to me was that he knew he needed to stop and he just didn't know how. Um, and then 2 years in, he was finally ready. And that's an incredible honor for me. Being really honest about that has been, and I feel like as a white woman of privilege and there are so many people who can't say it. It's just another strike against them. Like if I was a single mom of color, like so many people might hold that against me. And I feel like if I can make it easier for someone for whom saying that they have substance use disorder is a massive hurdle for them, I'm going to keep saying it until it's okay for everybody to say it. If it's okay for me, then I need to be saying it more and more and more so that I can pave the way for other people to be able to say it.
I feel like, so much of your work is obviously for the next generation. You're thinking about children and raising them, and your history as an educator and as a parent and all of this. It's to pay it forward, right? These kids, we want to do our best by them, but it's also you're helping the original people, the parents, the
Yeah.
generation who's could do better or worse, or could, learn from our mistakes. I feel
Well,
like,
and it's a real thing in a family, because if my kids and my nieces, let's say hypothetically, none of them end up developing substance use disorder, like it doesn't mean that it's not in their genetics or their epigenetics, but it does mean that that's been interrupted, right? So I grew up with someone with substance use disorder, and it was not fun. It was not a good thing. But at least for my nieces, because my sister does not have substance use disorder, at least for my nieces and for my kids, that's been interrupted because I got better when my kids were fairly young. So they have not had to witness an alcoholic parent, right? So, and by the way, and I'm going to borrow this borrow it in the sense that I am so intrigued and respect it, and hopefully not in a sense of cultural appropriation, but I get to learn so much when I go to these big conferences about substance use prevention and recovery. And I just came home from one of those conferences, and they were talking about recovery in tribal and indigenous communities. And recovery there looks a little bit different from recovery for someone like me, because what they're trying to do there is make people whole again, and that includes returning them to their culture. And they have a real belief around, they have this 7 generation idea that the things we're trying to do today will affect people 7 generations down. And this substance use prevention cannot be like, we cannot have we can't have a short-term lens. That's not even how you say that. But this is something that changes slowly over time. But look how far we've come. I mean, substance use, if you look at I have all these tables of statistics around like lifetime abstaining from drugs and alcohol and past month use and all that sort of stuff for adolescents. We have been in over a decade-long decline in substance use among adolescents, not so much emerging adults, but among adolescents. And that's because we know prevention works. But 10 years ago, it would have been, if we look just at each year's incremental change, that's frustrating. We got to look over longer periods of time, whether that's 7 generations, and I love that idea, or whether that's just interrupting it with my generation so that my kids' kids can have a better shot at not developing substance use disorder during their lifetime. We have to be thinking ahead. This has got to be about them.
Do you think that it's helpful that there's so many, first of all, there's like this whole sober curious moment going on. Mm-hmm. And I think that's great. But I also, so my sister, who won't mind that I'm sharing this, is an addict. And so she's been in recovery for years, and she can't, and I don't drink. Mm-hmm. But our reasons for this are very different. So I didn't really have a problem, so to speak. I felt like it added to my anxiety. And I was like, you know what? This is just not helpful in my life. So I'm just going to knock it off. And that was that. My sister, however, had a problem with it. And so she, through struggle, stopped having a problem with it, which is stopped using it. Always has a problem. But there's a lot of mocktails on the market. Right. And I love a mocktail. I'm like, And it kind of gives you that sense of, it's almost like if you're drinking a decaf coffee.
Right.
You're not, it's the act of it. It's the ritual of, I'm going to sit down and have this warm drink.
Hmm.
And so I love a mocktail for that feeling. Whereas my sister is like, I'm not having a mocktail because
Right.
that feeling is nothing I should be near ever in my life.
Right.
Do you see that in any way helping or hurting? What do you think of that? I'm just curious.
The evidence on that is really not clear. We don't have great studies on it. It's really an individual thing. So for me, mocktails. So I did a lot of my drinking while I was preparing dinner before my husband was home, so I could get a really good buzz on before he ever got home. So for me, drinking something fancy while making dinner is a thing for me. So now I live on, I have a very, very, very small farm slash very humongous garden. And I make a lot of like syrups, berry syrups and things like that. And I am a massive seltzer drinker. So put something fizzy with the berry syrup. That's my fancy drink. That's really important to me. On the other hand, I'm a big non-alcoholic beer fan. For me, I've been sober now for almost 14 years. So far, that has not been a trigger for me. It scratches the itch of I like the taste of beer. I love the taste of a fancy sort of mixed thing. And I totally appreciate the fact that a lot of restaurants are developing mocktails. It's fantastic. But if you, a lot of people, especially people in 12-step recovery, are like, absolutely not mocktails, non-alcoholic beer. That is the thin end of a wedge. I think there are a lot of fights between factions in recovery. And the reality is, it really comes down to what you know about yourself and staying sober. The problem is that I know that my brain is broken when it comes to using substances. So, I mean, maybe I've been tricking myself for 14 years about whether or not I can have non-alcoholic beer, and I also have a spouse who keeps a super close eye on me and he's very careful and he's very um, conscientious about, like I said, about having open containers. That's not a thing in our house. So it's a very individual decision, with the caveat that we have to be really careful because our judgment about what is getting us in trouble and what's not getting us in trouble can be broken sometimes.
Yeah, I was just curious about that because they're everywhere now,
Yeah.
which to me is a
Well, and that leads to the second half of this, which is what's been really cool, what's been really amazing is for millennials, Gen Zs, it has been much, much more acceptable to choose sobriety, and not even sobriety, but just not really into drinking. Just because it's a choice that they're allowed to make, as opposed to, oh, I have a problem, I have to stop drinking. Lots and lots of kids are telling me it's just a choice that they've decided to make because they're learning more. It's only been in the last generation that we've been able to look inside the human brain while it's working and know what's happening in there. And so all this information we have about what alcohol and drugs do to the human brain, and especially what they do to the adolescent brain, this is all new information. And as it trickles down to the people whose brains are concerned and the decisions they make around drugs and alcohol, if you know that using weed on a regular basis can make it so that your hippocampus is smaller than it would be for example, that we know that the hippocampus, which is right where the receptors are for the cannabinoids, the active ingredient in weed, we know that those kids tend to have smaller hippocampuses. And hippocampus is the seat of memory formation and consolidation. And there's a reason that people on weed have bad short-term memory, and it's because of that proximity to the hippocampus. So if I tell a kid who has big goals for her future around, I don't know, going to med school and having to learn a ton of stuff, and I tell her that if she is a regular user of weed, her short-term memory just won't be as good, that can be a really important lever for helping kids understand that. And so a lot of kids are, now that they're beginning to understand that, schools are working really hard to get that information down to them. they can make more informed decisions, and they are. They are making more informed decisions. They just are. I'm seeing it over and over and over again. And the surveys, risk surveys we see, tell us the same thing.
It's awesome to think of. And you're right, too. Just thinking back anecdotally to being I graduated high school in 1992. It wasn't, if you were at a party, you drank a beer. It wasn't, there was somebody who opted out. You just didn't go. So if you wanted to be in the social setting, you did what you did in the social setting. Whereas now I do think that the kids they're coming so much further along. Thank goodness. I feel like leaps and bounds. I watch my kids and I'm like, oh my God, you do so many more impressive, or you handle yourself not all the time, by the way. I just want to give that caveat. Every so often, my husband's like, will they ever not make stupid decisions? I'm like, well, not until they're about 25.
When their frontal lobe is done developing and they've filled in, yes, they will.
Yes. Go ahead.
Since your podcast is for women, I just want to make sure that we cover a few things about women and alcohol.
Please.
Number one, we are lacking an enzyme that allows us to break down alcohol as efficiently as it breaks down in men's bodies. So all other things being equal, which it's really hard to make all other things being equal because our bodies are built different proportions of muscle to fat. So more water content in men's bodies than in women's bodies. So we automatically are breaking down alcohol more slowly, but we're also missing this enzyme. So we break down more slowly. Women who drink in order to manage anxiety, which is very much why I drank, because I drank in the evening, because I had trouble falling asleep because of my anxiety, which, joke's on me, alcohol makes anxiety worse.
Yeah.
Also, you will wake up around
let me just pipe in. Yes.
You will wake up around 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the morning, having an anxiety attack. And that's because alcohol messes with your sleep. Sleep and drugs and alcohol have a bidirectional effect on each other. People who get too little sleep tend to use more drugs and alcohol. People who use more drugs and alcohol tend to get too little sleep. So that's all important to know. But if women drink in order to manage their anxiety, they are more likely than not to develop substance use disorder. So if you are drinking to manage your anxiety, not only does that not work, it feels like it works in the short term. It works so great in the short term. This is, as so many things with drugs and alcohol, it works until it doesn't work anymore. And when it doesn't work anymore, it's awful. And also, if you're drinking to manage anxiety, you're more likely than not to start having a problem, to become a problem drinker, to have a problem with alcohol, to start misusing alcohol, to use all of the euphemisms.
An anecdotal story here when you just said that. So my sister's drug of choice was heroin for a while. And God, I hope that was okay to say. Anyway, the point is that she actually at one point.
Not great for anxiety either, although.
No, but okay. So my sister, when my children were very little and my sister was a young mom, this is when it all happened. She was she was fun Aunt Michelle. She was so much fun. And my kids, they were like, oh, let Aunt Michelle watch us. I mean, I would come home, she would have them out and they would have Sharpie written all over them. I'm like, there's a million kids markers. Why would you put Sharpie? Why would you let them? But she was so much fun. She's making tunnels. She's making forts. She's so relaxed. And I'm like a barrel of nerves. Well, come to find out, she's on heroin and she's on.
But also, they're not her kids. That's just grandkids. That's why grandkids are so much more fun than your own kids, because they're not your kids. You can give them back. You don't have to deal with.
Well, she had her kid there too. She had her child there too. So I do have to give her credit. But the point is that once she stopped using drugs and she had to contend with being a sober parent, I was like, we are actually very similar. Like, I didn't know because her addiction started so young and we didn't realize that this was we assumed it was her personality, but it wasn't. It was this addiction. And so it turns out that she's actually pretty anxious also. She's, got her own set of anxieties and this was a coping mechanism. And she actually said at one point when I was saying that I was on anxiety and I was being treated for anxiety, and she's like, oh, don't use heroin because it really, it's like really helps at first. And I was like,
Yeah.
I'm not gonna. I was like, I was just, thinking possibly Zoloft, but I'm
Yeah.
not going to jump to that. But it's just interesting because anyway, that was my
Yeah.
anecdotal take, but
I
it
think
obviously doesn't work. These things
right.
don't work. And there's a
And
reason.
when our kids see us not coping with our anxiety in a healthy way, then they're less likely to cope with their anxiety in a healthy way. And on top of all of that, you have to remember one of the important things to remember about people who start using drugs and alcohol when they're really young is this is a bit of an overstatement, but also kind of generally true, is that their coping mechanisms and development, their emotional development gets arrested at the age pretty much when they started using. So in the sense that they don't have coping mechanisms because the drugs have been their coping mechanism, right? So I could have learned so much more about managing my anxiety if I had gone to see a therapist and talked about my anxiety or had a regular mindfulness practice, which is why I talk about that in the addiction inoculation. I tried to get my daughter to do a mindfulness practice with me, and she grudgingly did it with me and then basically referred to it as dumb. She didn't like it. But then I come to find out she developed her own mindfulness practice that she continues to this day. It's just she needed the one that worked for her, not mine. So helping guide kids toward healthier outlets for whatever it is they're feeling and wanting to self-medicate is one of the most important things that we can do. And they're not gonna we don't give them a solution. They're like, oh, thanks, mom. Yes, I'm gonna go use your solution in order to manage my issues. But they're at least seeing us doing some of the problem solving about how to manage our stuff, or giving them ideas, or giving them a starting place to think about, the mindfulness thing. That wasn't her favorite way to do it, but she has a different favorite way to do a mindfulness practice. And it's become incredibly important to her, and it does not resemble mine at all. But yay that she has one.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And all of this, well, first, I know you said you had something else to say about women. I didn't know if I cut you
Nope,
off.
that was it. That
Okay.
was pretty much
Okay.
all of it. Oh, no,
Well,
one last thing.
go
One
ahead.
last
Go
thing.
ahead.
So I just finished treatment for breast cancer, and we know drinking raises the risk of breast cancer. So when I talk to my nieces about substance use prevention, I talked a lot about their genetics, and we talk a lot about traumatic things that have happened to them, and the fact that, it can be really tempting to manage those things you don't want to think about with drugs and alcohol. I don't know if my drinking caused my breast cancer. We can't know that. But isn't it interesting that I drank and I ended up with breast cancer? And it's just, if we think about the way kids make decisions, they tend to, when people say adolescents don't understand the consequences of their actions, that is not true at all. What we do know about adolescent decision making is they tend to weigh the possible positive benefits of a decision heavier than the possible negative outcomes of a decision. So it's on us to help them, understand the actual real risks, whether that's their genetics, whether that's they have a hockey tournament tomorrow and they're going to feel really crappy when they wake up for that 5 a.m., report to the hockey rink thing, or, geez, breast cancer is also one of those things floating out there. And I know that alcohol is a carcinogen and can increase risk for breast cancer. I don't care as long as I'm being honest about the risk factors and it's coming from a place of evidence. I'm going to put as much out there as I can to help kids really think about that possible negative outcome side.
Definitely, because while it may not have caused your breast cancer, it certainly
Right.
doesn't help, right? It's not,
No.
it's a poison. Anyway, I'm sorry. Yeah, but
I think that's the other
no
thing is I
judgment.
think that's going to become a much bigger part of the conversation. The more we understand about the damage that this drug does just from the moment it enters our mouth to our throat, and the caustic effect it has on our throat. Like throat cancer mainly only happens in people who smoke and drink, because those two things together really make the throat vulnerable to the carcinogens in both tobacco and all that sort of stuff. So we're going to learn. I think the next 20 years is, I think I hope that in terms of marketing to kids, in terms of marketing alcohol, in terms of understanding the real risks to the human body around alcohol, I think we're in a bit of a big tobacco moment with alcohol. We'll see. I'm hopeful. But I just want people to have the right information. I don't want them to look at Scandal and say, that's how you deal with your bad day at work. I want them to have at least a balanced understanding of the risk to a woman's body that's maybe not due to that one massive glass of, by the way, the glasses I had for wine towards the end of my drinking, I could fit most of a bottle of wine. I don't know if you've ever seen the Amy Schumer, it's a satire on Friday Night Lights. And the wine glass starts out like this big, but by the end, she's got a wine glass that she's kind of got to hold with both arms
No,
because
that's
they drank
awesome.
so because the wife in that the woman the male female lead in that show drank so much alcohol so much wine. Um, I just want a balanced view. And for kids, especially, I want them to be able to make good decisions. And if marketing is shouting at them really, really loud about all the possible benefits of having this brand of beer, you can look like this, you can be on the beach having a bonfire and have great looking girlfriend or boyfriend and all that stuff. I at least want to give them the other side of that same coin and explain how they're being manipulated by the media, explain how they're being manipulated by brands and what their brand loyalty is worth in dollars to that company because it's a lot. All of these things, I just want them to have, I've spent my entire adult life working with kids and I just want them to have the best information possible to make the best decisions they can so they can make it to adulthood with their brains and their mental health intact.
And I don't think as parents, there's anything we want more than that. But this is the last thing I wanted to ask you. So
Mm-hmm.
much of what, first of all, you're obviously highly educated in this field. You've done all your research. You know all these things. You can talk about it backwards and forwards, which is awesome. For a lot of people who aren't educated in this, it might seem there are people in the grind of their life, whatever
Right.
their life is, if they're driving a truck or they're maybe a cleaning person, and this isn't necessarily what they're thinking. They're getting through. They're
Mm-hmm.
thinking about dinner and how
Mm-hmm.
are we going to do this? And we're paying the bills, or it seems like it requires a lot of self-awareness and
Mm-hmm.
self-introspection, even to say, hey, I hate the term helicopter mom, which my son always calls me. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, I am in New Jersey and you're in Hawaii. Automatically that takes that away from me. Like I am definitely not a helicopter mom. But I just think it requires some self-awareness for
Mm-hmm.
us as adults. Do you have any recommendations about that? And I know this isn't necessarily your area of expertise, but how you step back to even get to the point where you're like, hey, of course I want the best for my kids, but I've got,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, whatever your challenge is, everybody's got challenges, whatever it is, to step back enough to recognize, to look at yourself, whether it's the alcoholism you're bringing to
Mm-hmm.
the table, or if it's your sense of perfection and, fixing them over fixing and helping them.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any suggestions for how you even get to that first step to even, pick your book up? Because it's
Yeah, it's
such valuable information in it. When we first hopped on the call before we
mm-hmm.
recorded, I was like, oh, I got stressed because what do I want? I want the best for them.
Mm-hmm.
And any possible way that I have not provided the best for them
Mm-hmm.
will, as an anxious person, just continue to fuel my anxiety. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that as
Yeah, so
one anxious
the
mom to
hardest, I think one of the hardest parts of, my job is to teach people about this stuff and to get in the room. Sometimes I have to be a little tricky and talk about like, oh, this is a talk about learning in the brain, gift of failure, but I'm going to sneak a little bit of substance use prevention in there because some people are just really resistant to it, either because they have their own issues. Like I'm not going to a substance use prevention talk when I was drinking. Like that would make me the shame and guilt would be too much. Lots of people say they don't want to come to my in-person events because they're especially in their community because they don't what if someone sees them and thinks, oh, she's worried about her son Sam, like what about that, or whatever. So there's lots of hurdles to getting in the door to learn about this stuff, so I try to make it as easy as possible. So the book is out there. I read the audiobook version. If you want to listen to it in the car, listen to it with earbuds so no one can even, and you can do other stuff while you listen to it. Then a friend of mine who I really respect, I was lamenting how hard it is to get people to come and listen to talks about substance use prevention, just like it's hard to get people to come to like how to have the sex talk or how to have the talk about porn or whatever. um, she's like, you don't mind doing video. So I started doing these 90-second videos that are on my Instagram reels, but also indexed on my website because my friend was like, look, maybe people just want to consume this stuff privately and in very small chunks. So it's not overwhelming. I'm like, great. So I made almost 400 videos about every aspect of the addiction, inoculation, gift of failure. And now I'm doing a whole series on student and parent questions. I don't care how you get the information. I just want you to have really good evidence-based, research-backed information. And so if you have an idea about another way to get it to people, toss it to me. I think the conversation is so important and yet so scary for so many people that to ease them into it. I mean, lately, my entire marketing strategy has been, how do I get people to come to this who wouldn't normally come to this? And especially with schools who feel like they have a duty to get this information to parents, and yet no one shows up if it's a straight up substance use prevention talk. I'm fully willing to wheel in my Trojan horse, like at a gift of failure talk, and explain that one of the most important, like when I get to that competence section and explain that competence, self-efficacy, mastery, all that stuff, which is so important to gift of failure, is also really important to substance use prevention. So I do a lot more virtual gigs so that people can register and be anonymous and just listen to it while they're cooking dinner, whatever. We've had to get really creative about meeting people where they're at. And sometimes that means that, I have to be a little sneaky to get in the door, but I'm willing to do that only because I feel like this is so important. And I go and speak at places like I speak at Canyon Ranch, which is a hoity-toity spa.
Yeah.
And I've done that for the past, almost 10 years. And I usually get a very small group of people who are there trying to get healthy. And sometimes it's a really great place for them to dip their toe in and say, as part of the wellness picture, I wonder, and because there's no alcohol at Canyon Ranch, it gives people a really great opportunity to say, I miss wine more than I thought I would. What's going on? And there are also daily meetings at 12-step meetings at Canyon Ranch because the founder of Canyon Ranch was in recovery as well. So, I speak at schools, I speak at conferences, I speak at, Canyon Ranch if they'll have me. And I think that's just a part of trying to find a place that's less scary for people to start listening.
Well, and I think you said it right too, like going in as the Trojan horse, especially for, when you said you wouldn't have listened to a talk on substance abuse when you were drinking because the guilt, and I think there's so much guilt and shame in so much, anything you do as a mom, whether you, from the very beginning, did you breastfeed? Did you not breastfeed? Do you have guilt about that? There's so many things you can think of that you can take on as, I didn't do this right. I didn't do this right. Somehow I have failed. How can you work your way around it? And I love your Trojan horse metaphor because that's it. Just sneak it in. And it is good. And I especially love, by the way, the last takeaway I want to say that, and it's your words, was that it's your thoughts. If you it's not the end, like just like what you say to your kids, if you've messed this up, we're going to go forward. This isn't the end. It's okay. There's more than one day to raise a human. It doesn't happen that one time or that 1 year even, hopefully. So, thank you for that. I think it's good reassurance.
Absolutely. It's the around gift of failure stuff or around addiction inoculation stuff. You can say, you know what, sweetie, I'm really sorry. I have been underestimating what you can do for yourself and I've been doing too much for you. And that's going to stop today. So let's pick homework. I'm no longer going to nag or remind about your homework. That's you. And by the way, I've already let your teacher know that I'm backing off. This is something that I used to have to do when my kids were in school. I don't use the portal as a parent. So I would get in touch with the teachers and say, by the way, I don't use the portal. I'd rather just have actual communication with my kids. So I won't be checking up on anything on the portal. And so here's the best way to reach me if things start to circle the drain. And, your first line of communication should be with my kid. So it's not a matter of like, I'm going to stop reminding you about homework and that's it, you're on your own. There's a little bit of a, it's in education, we call it scaffolding. Here, it's sort of like training wheels. You're pulling back, but you're also letting people know the best way to get in touch with you. And I prefer that you talk to my kid first, but here are some ways that we could step in. And anyway, it's all in gift of failure and in addiction inoculation, the same thing. Sweetie, I didn't fully understand risk factors when it comes to substance use, like drinking or using weed. And I learned some stuff. And so we're going to change some of our house rules around substance use. And here's what they are. And here's why. The why is so important. And, I'm sorry I got it wrong before, but now I'm going to move forward with the information I have and try to do my best.
That was awesome. Thank you so much for being
You're
here.
so welcome.
I'm so grateful for so many reasons. It was awesome. You are the best. Thank you.
So grateful to you too. Thank you so much.
I really appreciated this conversation with Jessica Lahey, especially the way she challenged so much of what we carry as moms. That pressure to get it right, to do more, to step in before anything goes wrong. Next week, we're stepping into another tough but really important conversation. We're talking about prevention, power, and what it actually takes to address sexual assault before it happens, with Jess Ladd and Kristen Hatcher of the Fund to Prevent Sexual Assault. In the meantime, if this episode made you think of another mom in your life, send it to her. That's how these conversations keep going. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week on Roar.